colleague Brian Lamb, who will be facilitating this session. Brian's been working tirelessly in the field of open education for a number of years. Always has interesting things to share and ways to engage you in that conversation. So without further wasting of time, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Cindy. Yeah, and actually I brought a couple of ringers with me, so I'll be doing relatively little talking today, or so you all hope. I have Wyatt Wasserman here with me and Jeff Miller, and I'll let them talk a little bit more about what they actually do when I hand things over to them. But before I get too much into stuff, how many people were at the session just prior to this, the great debate? Did any of you, I mean, obviously there was only the chance for a few questions, and given that I think this is somewhat relevant, I wondered if anyone had any thoughts that came out of that debate, or some of the points that came up that might be relevant to the idea of using alternative platforms for teaching and learning that they didn't get a chance to air during the debate itself. Yeah.
Well, just that there seems to be a very clear line drawn between open and closed. Closed being what we were referring to as the formal education environments, and open being the more social media environments. And I'm not so sure that we need to keep that line solid.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting observation. I think it will be pertinent to what we're talking about today, because we will be using tools that get thrown under the rubric of social media, but they don't really look like what people do on Facebook either, for the most part. I think too, the one thing I would have asked, and I think the question kind of came up at the end, Morgan asked it, but I would have asked it a little more pointedly, was this notion too that social media activity tends to happen in places like Facebook or on Twitter or via blogs on sites like Google, Blogspot, things like that. And I must admit, 3 or 4 years ago, kind of when we started to reach a breaking point in terms of scale in hosting weblogs at UBC, when we realized we couldn't do it with one co-op student and no money anymore, that I started to kind of ask the question, well, you know, WordPress.com is pretty awesome. Why are we even in this business? Why are we spending our time on this? We could be much more profitably spending our time actually talking to people, and finding out what they might want, and actually talking about practice, which I promise we will in a few minutes. But I must admit, given how the social media space has been turning in the last few years, I'll just point to 2 or 3 anecdotes. If you follow the ethics, so-called ethics of Facebook, for example, that without notifying any of their users, implement a program such as Beacon, which actually tracks your behavior even when you're not inside Facebook. So it tracks the books you're buying on Amazon. It's tracking your searches on Google. Just a little trick. I mean, you would have, essentially, if you're logged into Facebook and you forgot to log out when you left the environment, it was still following what you were doing. And was packaging that information up and selling it to marketers. So I think there's a basic ethical, beyond the legal issue, which I think Andre referred to in that last segment. But I must admit, things like that, Google and Yahoo have both engaged in behavior around protection of privacy with regards to governments in China, for example, that I would only describe as unethical. I must admit that I've kind of started to turn the other way and started to think that something like an open source platforms are important. So that's why I thought we're going to kind of narrow the focus of social media a bit. I'm not saying that those other tools can't be used really interestingly or effectively. They are all over this campus. But we're going to kind of narrow our focus a little bit to open platforms and open tools, so in that sense, and ones that are actually supported here on campus. I guess too, this idea of open education, I'd like to define it as widely as possible, and I think you'll see that when we get into the examples. I think for a lot of people, so I'm just going to get this out of the way right now, you say open course, open education, people just kind of think this is the gold standard here. MIT OpenCourseware, and I'm not putting them down. They made a commitment 10 years ago to put all of their content from all of their undergraduate and a significant amount of their graduate courses online for free with a public reusable license. And it is a phenomenal resource. Some of it's just scanned PDFs of scrawled lecture notes, but in other cases, it's actually quite rich learning materials. They've invested a lot of money in this. And there's considerable evidence of other universities adopting some of these frameworks. So it's been, without question, an influential project. But it also kind of creates this standard like, wow, that's what open education is. You need a big university-wide initiative. You need the president to stand up and say, this is one of the top 2 or 3 priorities of our institution, or we can't get into this game. I think that's a little pernicious. Along those lines too, another project which actually we have a little session on here, this is a somewhat more modest approach, but this is much more pedagogically driven. I just kind of put this up here for interest, where it's a much smaller number of courses that have actually been specifically developed by Carnegie Mellon University. So they call this the Open Learning Initiative. And it is actually a fully fledged platform of online teaching materials. And students actually pay a modest fee, something like $20 per student. And it's really effective use of things like real-time data, tracking students' behavior on exercises, and actually providing real-time feedback to instructors. And this is actually a platform that can be adopted by other institutions on top of that. But again, the typical amount of investment for one of these courses to be developed is anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million a piece. Not a huge number of courses there, although most of the large survey courses are represented. So again, an intimidating model. This isn't something we're going to decide we're going to do here in this room and get into action on. And I won't show the site, but I should just point out wiki.ubc.ca/open_platforms URLs to all the examples we're going to show here today. And then there's one more I'm not going to show you, but the site OER Commons, I'll show it to you very quickly, actually lists a lot of the kind of formal open educational resource collections that you can find on the web. And I must admit, when we started talking about this stuff at UBC, the field was, people say, well, great, I want to use this stuff. Well, where's the content? And you'd go to these so-called learning object repositories like Merlot or whatever, and you'd be lucky if you found teaching and learning materials you could actually use in your context. We've definitely reached a point where that's not the case. I can't guarantee that every specialized interest you have is represented in one of these collections or another, but in a broad sense, there is now, we can actually say, an abundance of open content available. So again, these tend to be, though, relatively formal, funded projects, not the kind of thing we can just jump into on our own. So I guess what I was hoping we might discuss here are a couple of initiatives or a couple examples of practitioners here at the university who are using open source platforms to create structures of interaction, use materials, engage in a range of activities that will come forward, and for the most part, there might be some tweaks, but there actually are some practices here that I think almost any instructor who wants to do it could probably begin to move down this path almost immediately without really spending money, which I think is significant. And I don't know if that's an appropriate point to hand off to you, Jeff, but I'm going to hand it to you there. Anyway.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jeff Miller. I'm the manager for distance learning with the Office of Learning Technology. And it puts me in a curious position. That's one of my hats. I'll tell you about another hat in a minute. It puts me in a curious position because we offer a lot of distance education courses at for campus. Around 7,000 enrollments a year, and that means that when we make a commitment to the systems that we use, we have to think with some scale, because if we choose a technology and it's kind of wonky, or it's there one day and it's not the other, or it doesn't scale very well, it puts us into a very difficult position, but more significantly, it puts students in bad situations. And so we've had that happen before with some early stuff with social media where there's a tool that's there and then suddenly it's gone. So we have to be somewhat conservative. One of the hats I also wear is I'm an instructor with Faculty Education's Masters of Educational Technology. So there are 2 courses that I teach, and there are other courses that I play a role as a designer. And one of the things that we try to do in that program is we want to expose the master's students, who are principally teachers either in the K-12 or the post-secondary sectors, to a lot of different learning technologies. And so what we're consciously doing in that program is getting them to use things like vendor-based Big Iron WebCT kind of systems and understand what that's about. But at the same time, we also have them interact with things like Moodle, which is an open source course management system. And I'll show you in a couple courses, we do quite a bit of work with WordPress, and before that with movable type, but in a blogging platform, and also with a MediaWiki instance. Now, the key thing there, though, is that we are trying to hit two points. One is that educators today need to be able to evaluate communication tools, presentation tools, interaction tools. They need to be able to make decisions in their classrooms about what they're going to use. And so there's a whole way of thinking that critically and practically. A second thing is to think about, well, what are the affordances of these spaces in terms of student interaction? We were talking about engagement in the last section. How do we get people to engage? And are there ways that these sites might allow people to engage differently? And in a couple of the courses that I teach, those questions are the really fun ones and the really creative ones to explore. Let's go to the first. I want to show you an example of a course. David Vogt, who was on one of the panelists there, who was saying that social media is bad. Well, he had his tongue in his cheek for most of that talk, because a couple of years ago we sprung his course entirely out of WebCT and we designed it so it functions entirely within WordPress. And so what the first question that comes up is, well, why did we do that? Well, we wanted to do that because we wanted to share a publishing platform with students so that they had the ability to put their voices, their ideas on the same level as the instructors. And so this is a course called Ventures in E-Learning, and it's about thinking about how to develop businesses or innovations using learning technologies either as an entrepreneur or as someone working with an institution. And one of the really interesting challenges of this for me as a designer was thinking, well, on the one hand, if you can pull up maybe some of the content on the left here, we still had, kind of static content, like course materials that we wanted to have people go through, So some of this stuff at some point existed within kind of a course management system hierarchy. And that content is relatively static in that it's not going to change dramatically during the course of a semester. But it is a springboard for conversation. It is a springboard for interaction and activities. And so what we work to do is say, well, all right, so this is one way to navigate through this content, and this is somewhat static. But then this whole part of WordPress and this whole part of WordPress all was generated by the students. So we built a back end in terms of setting up categories that were aligned to the topics, setting up, basically teaching the students quickly that when you make a posting, tag it and categorize it. And then automatically, as students started posting, for instance, in, let's say, Module 1 Introductions, the category appeared, and all of that content organized itself under that category. And then we also taught them how to keyword tag, so they started to be able to make thematic linkages in their postings that allow people now to interact with that content in a non-linear fashion. And for some of the students, this was very chaotic, very confusing. They weren't sure exactly how to work with it. And there's an element of risk here, because all of this is happening in public, right? So this is a weblog that is public. Anyone in the world can read it. But you have to log in if you're going to post or comment. So one of the issues that I'm going to raise, and I hope we talk about a little bit, is the whole question of, when you're in social media, do you have to be entirely public? Can you also be private? Or a combination of the two? And why might you choose to be private or public in relation to your teaching goals and the kind of learning environment you're creating? So this is one example where the whole course, everything, including the kitchen sink, is out in social media. And then I should say that there's an assignment here where a lot of students went off and picked their own tool, like Ning or some other platform, and did work there, and then fit that back into the course. Can you pop up ETech 510? Oh, I'm sorry.
So can I just ask you maybe one point of clarification? When you say logged in, you mean logged into the blogging platform?
Logged into the blogging platform,
Yeah.
yes. And so here's something that's really important to think about, because I've got some kind of course management issues later on that I want to raise, and that is, before we worked to integrate the campus-wide login authentication gateway into the weblogs, we had to hand code everyone in. It was a terrible job. It was a hateful job. And even now, with the setup the way it is, it's a lot of work to set up weblogs for a full class, especially if you're doing it in a rolling way, session to session. But the login really helps us in terms of establishing some principles for access, which can be beneficial either for full access or limited access. Any other questions about this before I move on? Oh, yes.
It's sort of related. Are there any privacy issues? When you post something, is it anonymous or is your name on there?
Well, there are all kinds of privacy issues. Oh boy, there are privacy issues. So, well, on the one hand, we have to let the students know this is happening in public. So maybe there are some behaviors that you should change. So when you're introducing yourself, maybe don't put your phone number and your email address, because someone might come by and scrape the site and now they've got that information. So we have to prepare the students for what the space is, and if we're worried about safety, we talk about it. Quite often when you set up a default weblog, things like pings and trackbacks are left activated, and that's just a vector for spam. So suddenly you're sitting there and a bunch of spam starts showing up in your comment lines. And so there are things that you need to think about ahead of time so that, I mean, again, depending on your goals, you probably don't want spam intermixed. You might have some issues about, you might have an activity where you want it to be fully anonymous. And the exchanges on the site are fully anonymous because that's important for you, or you might not. And I think the reasons for that have to be clear to you and then communicated to your students.
You might address this later, but is this scalable? Is this a model that you would take and scale across university?
I would not, right now, try to offer all the distance courses in this model, because it's not scalable to that extent. But every time we look at the ability to kind of reset an architecture of a blog and kind of pass that architecture on to a new instance, and we're getting better at that, it's getting closer to being scalable. But blogs as they're currently, and Brian, you can help me with this a bit, blogs as they're configured currently don't work very well with the package that we use in academia, which is the kind of a unit of a course in a semester. Right. But that's okay, because you can work with that for different kinds of projects for knowledge building, community building. But that's one of the decisions you have to think about when you start moving in this space.
I would certainly say that, I mean, what we're doing here replicates about 3/4 of what, say, a WebCT does, at least in terms of publishing and interaction. It doesn't have the same degree of, say, course management things. There's no grade book or anything like that. And so certainly the degree of depth and the amount of design work that goes into this isn't your typical course blog. Time permitting, at the end, I'm going to show a few more examples that maybe aren't. And this is, to be clear too, is a fully distanced course. There's no face-to-face component here. I would dare say the vast majority of course blogs and open platforms that people are using are complements to face-to-face courses, where obviously those kind of demands are much lighter.
And one other just quick point to make in terms of, a weblog only gives you top channel communications, in terms of people posting. And a lot of students complain that they have no back channel communication, like you can email behind the scenes and things like that. So we're experimenting with BuddyPress to try to bring some of that functionality in, but it's really worth experimenting with this, but thinking about learning interactions, not just, everyone's a publisher. It's different. Let's pull up 510. I want to show that other example because I'm conscious of time. Another course, I'm teaching this course right now. This is a course on instructional design in the net. And this is a wiki project that Mary Bryson and I came up with, where we've had now, this is the 4th year where students have been going through this. It's a wiki on design, and again, it's fully open to the public, so anyone can read it, and we have a lot of people reading it, but only students and alumni of the course can author in it. And you'll notice again, so I'm playing again with this idea, there's a public aspect to this, because I want the student work to be out there, and when the students' write work here is published, but I am not interested in people from outside participating in this collaborative writing space. And I have reasons for that, and I'm happy to talk about those. Pull up any of them, Brian. I'm marking this right now. I have a digital divide one. That's been a really interesting one to develop. So this page was originally authored in 2007 by a student. Students came back through in 2008 in 2 different cycles and did revisions on it. And now we've had 2 more groups of students come in. This is a community knowledge building project that's now 4 years old. We've had 800 authors go through, contributing, building, expanding. This has been quoted by experts in terms of people who are out there, they find reference to their work, they're coming in and they're complimenting the students. This is an authentic site of practice for people who are building a resource. And they feel very connected to it, very proud of it, but it belongs to the students, right? And so as a collaborative writing environment, this wiki is marvelous because it really supports kind of creative extension. It gives them a real strong sense of ownership, and they treat one another as peers, scholarly peers, intellectual peers in this field, which is a really important thing. Now I'm marking an assignment right here at the moment. So if you go to history, Brian.
I'm sorry?
If you go to the history tab, you know, for anyone who evaluates writing, what's really nice is, so here, if we keep scrolling down, I mean, I can get a sense of how much effort someone put in, which is not a very good way to look at it, just because coincidence. I can look at the contributions. I can bring up comparisons of two different pieces of writing in terms of seeing what the changes are. And all of these can feed into a kind of a formative assessment of how a piece of writing evolves. So this is a very good example of the way in which you can use a wiki as a collaborative knowledge-building structure within a whole course, and not just do it 1 year. So when we built this so it's going to last multiple years. I'm hoping we get this thing will continue to grow and evolve.
As opposed to the rolling cohort model that you're putting in with the weblog, this is a ever-growing onion. You're adding more layers.
Ever-growing onion. Though even with the weblog, I can historicize an instance of that and then make reference back in an archival sense.
Okay.
Or if I wanted to activate that, kind of continue on the flow.
Yeah.
You know, depending on what my intentions are in the space. These spaces have different affordances again, and it's worth thinking about. Let's pull up the last example, which is ZTech 540. And Brian and I are co-conspirators in this course. And I'm just going to say one thing about this, and because, again, time. We've been teaching this course going back about 8 years, and this course really looks at the changing spaces of writing and reading in relation to technology. We go all the way back to papyrus, and all the way forward to weblogs, and talk about stuff. Lots of things are interesting. This is a community weblog. It's a collaborative blog that all of the students in the course author. All of the content here is theirs, right? So they completely drive and own this site. Brian and I created a structure for them to take on. Now, what was interesting this year is that we moved everything into a weblog wiki space this year, whereas before we did that activity in a web space. So we just basically gave students tabula rasa. You have access to a web space, do something with it. Now, on the one level, what they build here is marvelous, it's creative, it's interesting, it takes great advantages of what a weblog or a wiki structure can offer. On another level, it's far less interesting in terms of kind of creatively exploring the affordances of the spaces. Because you get them in a weblog, they're going to write a blog entry. Get them in the wiki, they're going to write a Wikipedia entry. But you don't necessarily get them to critically examine those spaces in a way that is kind of the core of what this course is all about. So on the one hand, from a student management issue, it was pretty easy to work in this space. But I was a little bit disappointed that it wasn't as jaunty and creative a space with full student control as some of the older ones. And so there's a whole set of genre questions that I think people who are interested in writing and what happens in these spaces. It's not just transmission of messages, but these spaces structure communication. And people in this field need to pay some attention to that. So I don't know, is that a fair characterization, Brian?
Yeah, no, I mean, and that was, I mean, for years, Jeff and I, at the beginning, pretty much since the second year we taught the course together, we would sit down at the beginning of the year, and every year I would just say, I can't believe we're still having these students construct their own HTML pages. These things called content management systems now. I like blog-based ones, but there's lots of other approaches, and this is just, it's like, to me, obviously, we're teaching them an archaic technology, and Jeff would always basically respond with the argument here. He said, well, but it is, it's a blank slate, and we're not imposing a structure on them. And it was like year after year we went at it, and so yeah, this year, actually, it was Jeff who decided, because Jeff always decided. And, because I defer to it, for obvious reasons. And I had to acknowledge, I think it definitely raised the bar in terms of what the weakest entries tended to be, so the barriers to entry became much lower. Students definitely adapted quicker. We had way fewer technical support questions to answer. We used to actually have 2 students who were designated as essentially for part of as webmasters. We didn't even have to do that, and even given that, it was, so. But at the same time, we weren't surprised as often. And although although we did tell students they could go to external platforms and author things and wherever they wanted, generally speaking, they got comfortable in that environment, they settled in, and they pretty much limited themselves there. So yeah.
And I think it was more of a cooperative than a collaborative space in a critical sense. And I think we can move on that by having each of the students doing their own blog and having full control over how that works. But what that lessens is the ability to do the interconnections, which is what we really wanted in it. If you go to that sample page, you can see all of the examples of the previous community webs, and some of them are really sophisticated and thematically complex, and so they're worth exploring. But I just want to make one more point about these last two courses, the 510 and 540. In both of those courses, we also have a WebCT site with content being delivered and forums, discussion forums taking place that are completely in private. And it works really well, because I guess one thing I'd like to leave you thinking about from my presentation is that social media isn't necessarily an either-or choice. You should be thinking about what your teaching intentions are and what kind of learning spaces will engender safety, comfort, and creative exploration. And when you go with social media, you don't have to be fully public, you don't have to be fully private, and you don't have to fully be in a social media space without having a CMS space. And there are reasons to think of a mixture of them. So the two courses that I think have worked very powerfully are hybrid models, where we use both a CMS structure and various versions of social media, because they have different affordances and different things to contribute. So that's my pitch.
I have to put forward a criticism, and I'll take off my Learning Technologies Manager hat and put my solder hat on, because this is one that I hear often. You've shown us 3 excellent examples, but inherently there's an easy criticism. There are 3 examples of teaching using technology about technology. So can you show us examples of platforms of, give me the biology, give me the business, give me the law, give me the...
Yeah, I'll let my other colleagues do that. I could. Yeah. And I guess the thing I would focus in on is that in courses where collaborative engagement around writing is really important, we will tend towards wiki structure. Yeah. Especially if we want to kind of have students interact in a writing space and maybe do some kind of community knowledge building. Yeah. If we are doing something that's more around reflective thinking, where we want kind of personal statements of scholarly progress, we're more likely to do that in a weblog. But you can also refract that weblog so that it's either working individually or collaboratively with a cohort. So I would point to the affordances of these spaces for different kinds of interaction. Right. And then the discipline, that will play out in the different disciplines accordingly.
As a follow-up to that, one of the presumptions people have about the MET program is that all the students are technophiles and all of them are in love with just ready to embrace these new technologies, and I would say actually, often largely not. Yeah. It's not a self-selecting cohort as much as people would think. And the same issues that I've had teaching other courses I face with MET students who are ostensibly going to be educational technology professionals. Why do we even have to use a platform? I don't want to learn how to write HTML code. The objections are the same.
Yeah. What's really gratifying through some of these experiences, though, is that a lot of educators in the school system go on to try to use these techniques. They sometimes implement them the next day. Yeah. That said, after putting them up the next day, they find out that their school has a firewall all around anything that is to do with social media, so they can't get in. Yeah. So there are all kinds of really interesting educational issues that are at play here.
And I think asking for someone from one of the disciplines outside of education technology might actually be a good time to call him live.
Yeah, super. Okay.
He's not one of us.
No, definitely. Though I have to say I'm married to one.
There you go.
My wife has a master's in educational technology from a long time ago, so I've at least been exposed. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience in running a course called Medical Genetics 421. It's a cancer biology, cancer genetics course. I've been running this with some educational technology components now for 3 years, so we're a little bit into the game, and I can tell you some of the good points and some of the bad points along the way. And one of the things that comes up when you start thinking about this course as an instructor, especially in the sciences, is we don't get very much time to allow for ourselves to put to these courses. So we're not going to be able to sit there and monitor active sites along the way. We're going to have to set up something, let it percolate along with minimal attention from us along the way, and then come back to it in a fairly intense waiting period. So it brings some limitations to how we can use these things along the way. So along the way, sort of who I am, I'm a computational biologist, and that means that my field is very much dedicated to open data, open access systems. Our field spawned the Public Library of Science, which is an open access repository. So our field has been here for a long time, along the way. So there may be a little bit more buy-in from people like me than some others. So if you can just advance the slides for me. If you want to, we can probably plug this in and then you can just not have to worry about it. So Natural Genetics 421 is a fairly compact class. It's about 35 students on average that we teach. These are high-end students, so they're almost all either going to graduate studies in life sciences or to medical school, about half and half. And it's pretty much an honors cohort that we take through the class. That's okay. When we start, we ask them sort of the obvious question, because we're going to use MediaWiki as a backing for doing some recording systems within the class. And so the first question is, how many people use Wikipedia? And I assume that it's like this group will be, all of us have seen Wikipedia, looked at articles. But I'll ask this group as well, how many of you have actually edited or modified a Wikipedia entry? So it's about the same. There's a relatively small number that have actually gone in and started changing the Wikipedia entry. And I encourage you all to go home and change a Wikipedia entry. It's very, very empowering to know that you can mislead the world. Okay, so most of them haven't done anything with it. They've read it, but they've been passive interactions with the MediaWiki software that underlies Wikipedia. So next slide, please. Despite the way this is going to come across, I think of myself as somewhat a Luddite in terms of how we use these things. I want things to be tried and tested. I don't want to be on the bleeding edge. I want the software to work. I don't want to be exploring new ground. I want to use things that are well documented. Same thing comes to educational styles. I think there's real advantages to classical lectures with someone standing in front of you and giving you material, making you take sort of the information in and work with it. In the cancer biology field, many of our lectures are guest lectures, and so we give them sort of a cohort, a basic set of lectures at the beginning of the course from the core instructors, and then after that we sort of bring in experts on topic areas as we go along. And the way the course is designed is, again, fairly traditional in the sense that half the course is standard exam-based. A quarter of the course is a weekly report that they have to write about something in the scientific literature. And then one quarter of the course is related to these MediaWiki projects. And we used to start having students do each an individual report. They would create a MediaWiki page and write about a gene related to cancer that they would choose to work on. And that was the first year. And since then, we realized that wasn't taking advantage of the platform and that the students weren't really getting the chance to interact with one another. And so now we've shifted a bit. And they still do their own individual gene report because I want them to be forced to go through the entire process of learning about the gene. And I don't want them to be writing on other people's efforts. But then they take their gene, and other students who work on genes that are related to their gene come together and they write a report about the set. And biology is pretty easy because we have pathways or systems where we can group things together that way. And so they now write this team report. And we've sort of, it's 3 to 1 on the scale right now. And we're working to find the balance.
He's doing it.
Oh, sorry.
I've moved on to the technology.
Very good.
That's why I don't like modern technology, I guess. One thing that's critical in doing this is that you're going to have to dedicate some time to teaching the students how to use the software. So that means you're taking cancer biology course time to introduce them how to use Wikipedia, MediaWiki successfully. So we've gotten it down to about 30 minutes. I bring in an instructor who's very good at teaching about this particular tool, and they walk them through the process. And then one thing that I found is critical from over the years is then you have to immediately make them go home and do some work in the system. And so I give them 5 points of their assignment grade is just very simple, making some headings and putting in some references and doing that within a day after the introductory lecture. And so that's critical to get them, force them to try it out. So there's links here, and we'll make sure that they're posted, and so you can go in and look at it. The Wiki Pages aren't all that exciting right now because they're just in the midst of working on them this year. And compared to what was done in Jeff's courses, we tear it all down and start fresh each year. And that's because I think they need to work their way through all the basic information. I don't want them to inherit that basic information. I want them to be forced to go out and learn it themselves. And so we do strip it out naked and come back fresh every year. And then one thing that the students love, because students love extra credit, is if they do a really good job with the report, And remember, these are high-end students, so many of them do. We then give them extra credit if they'll post it to Wikipedia themselves. And so you'll go to a lot of cancer-related genes on Wikipedia now, and you'll find a fair portion of the content is coming out of our students' coursework. And so there's a link to one, but there's many genes out there where you can go and see about half the Wikipedia is coming from our students' work. So, few observations. The students love this. They really do like to get in there and do it. They feel like they own something. They have the flexibility to choose a gene they're interested in. Many of them have personal connections to cancer, and so they are interested to work on genes that are related to the cancers they've been exposed to. The students put in far more effort than is required for a mark on this. So they really do buy in and engage and get exposed to it. One lesson learned is you have to put a word count limit on this. So the first year I had feces written on this thing.
More is better.
More is better. And so word count limits are extremely important when you have a format like this because students feel like they can go on forever. By putting a word count on that's fairly stringent, it's forcing them to go back and edit and think about it and modify it. And so a key lesson learned from the first year. It's important to connect it up to the processes that you're going through in the course. And so we have a series of lecture topics over the term, and so we make sure that the report requires elements touching on each of the processes that are introduced in the class. And so every lecture, they're getting some exposure to a topic. They can go back to their wiki, write down how their gene relates to that process in cancer. So that essentially there's a theme of the week that they work on. They write this paper summary, that they can choose the paper, which can be related to their gene, and so they have sort of an ongoing exposure to it. And again, combining the students together for the team projects really makes them buy in. These are difficult to grade. So as a scientist, are used to exam-based systems, and so we're not English professors, and we're suddenly dealing with long reports that students have composed. You need to make sure that the content is emphasized and not as really useful content that the students are creating. So they have a tendency, as was mentioned, to sort of spew out information on the page, and so you need to keep them on task. And that helps with the theme of the week and helps with the word counts to put them there. And as Jeff mentioned, going back over the history logs is really key here because you can, especially in the team projects, you can monitor which students contributed which things to it. It's fairly arduous to do it right now, the way Wiki is organized. And Jeff and Brian may know better tools for this, but I think it would be very convenient to have a logging system where you could go back to the beginning and sort of paste in the information as each student does and monitor which students are doing which things, and sort of give them points along the way for who's doing what. And that would make life a little easier for working with this. Forcing science students to do this really reveals a lack of understanding where it is, so we don't always get the chance to force them to express themselves in this way, and it's a powerful format for that. And it does take about 30 minutes per report to grade. So that means that you can do it for 30 students, which is about where we are, but if you can get much larger than that, it's impossible. And so what you will have to do then is abandon the individual reports probably and go with the team projects. And so you can grade probably 30 team projects with 4 or 5 members. So you could take it up to 150, 200 students in the class and do it successfully, but only on a team system, not individual. One thing that came up along the way, is probably true for anything like this, is that on the line they think they sort of forget all they've learned about plagiarism. And so making sure that they know how to make references and use quotation marks is important for this. For some reason they lose some of that connection. Making some explicit requirements, they have to hyperlink to other sites, they have to include figures, again, helps keep them on topic. And the nature of our course is that because we're doing a team project connected to the individual projects, we have to limit their selection of the genes to make sure that the genes can be grouped together so that there's an obvious team component to it. So we've been doing this for 3 years. I always think of teaching as a 3-year endeavor. So I go from terrible to pretty bad to pretty good in my 3 years of teaching, and so we're at a pretty good stage right now, which means next year I've got to tear it all down and do something again. So one thing we're going to be doing next year is we're going to do the Wiki project with other institutions. And so most research institutions have a course, a 4th-year course for cancer biology. And so at the beginning of my course, I had great buy-in with people providing me with slides and lecture materials and things to work up. And so I have a cohort of other instructors around the globe who are teaching these types of courses. And so we're going to take a group of us and have the students together on that, which I think will be very powerful for the students to get connected. I'm really starting to buy into the open textbook idea. So these are expensive textbooks for cancer biology. There's two very good ones, and that makes it a little hard for my particular field because it's hard to walk away from a strong textbook that's out there. But by working with the same groups that we're working on for the international course, we're going to be trying to develop some of the open textbook materials and some of the instructional materials for this course. And I think that's going to be, it'll take a few years to get it right, but we'll be in that transition over the next little while. And one thing I've been thinking about doing is we're very static on words right now, and so I think that there would be an opportunity to do some multimedia components here where students can not just write down about a gene, but could actually assemble, probably as a team, sort of an introductory lecture or a little video, something on the order of 5 minutes that could target maybe a high school level audience to talk about cancer biology.
Have you ever seen some of the things done in Second Life in terms of gene representations? There's some phenomenal
There's some great things there. You can go to YouTube and there's just some amazingly powerful videos for these things. And so one of the things I do in my class, I run a 90-minute session, and I find that you need to break it into two components to have their attention there. And so at the 45-minute mark, I give them a 2-minute science video off of YouTube every lecture. And the students, again, extra credit, powerful thing, extra credit if they provide me a video link that I use in the grade period. So they're all scanning through everything on YouTube, learning all this stuff along the way, trying to get a link that I haven't seen before. So that's sort of my brief overview, and I'll stop there, but I'm happy to take questions or comments about what we've been doing.
Did you have any students who were just very like, I cannot learn it, I can't learn the MediaWiki, I just don't know how, it's too hard?
It may not be a representative class. We're fourth-year science students in this class, and they're pretty high-end, but I have not had any difficulty with students so far. Again, we don't push them very hard. We have some basic MediaWiki instructional tools. There's only about 10 things to learn to get sort of basics of the report down, and they seem to grasp that after that first lecture. But we do have a TA in the class, and so when students have problems, we do sit down with them and walk them through things. Another thing with this class is they're very interactive. So these are fourth-year students who know each other pretty well as a group, and so they tend to talk to one another. And all the source material, all the source code is available for viewing on all the students' pages. So you can go and look to see what Johnny and everybody else in the class is doing, look at their code and copy it straight out, and then go and put your own content in to keep the formatting there. And that seems to help a lot.
If I could add one thing, I've had more response from students who were concerned about their assignments being in open space. So I mean, MediaWiki is very low threshold in terms of skill, but having people publish their work in public, that's a big issue for many students and for many academics.
Yeah, I haven't had anyone complain about that. It's an open page, anyone in the world can come in and see it where we have it, but it's not something that we link out to often. So we haven't had any evidence of them finding their way to the page.
And when you say strip out, so you have your core wiki that you start with, and at the end of the semester, do you back up all of those wiki pages? Okay. And are those archives still publicly available?
No.
Okay.
So I take the archives down. I leave it up for 8 months after the course, and then
prior to the beginning of the next, right?
Beginning of the next term. Leave it up there for the first week of the next term, so students can go in and see what people have done in the past.
Okay.
And then it comes down.
Is there a catered lunch today?
Yes.
Okay, so we should try to get out of here early, because last thing I want to do is have you guys at the back of the line for food. Thank you so much, Wyatt. I just thought, before we go, I'll try to compress this into about 5 minutes, just give you something like a crash overview, just of a couple of the platforms that actually are available for use, and just some of the features we've done that might hopefully get a few light bulbs off. Just to point out too, the main blog service is hosted at UBC Blogs. It is still, quote unquote, in a testing phase, which essentially means we haven't completely opened it up in the sense people just come in and create as many blogs as they want. Having said that, usually once we've talked to them and get a sense of what they want to do and what their expectations are, it's usually something we can accommodate. There's links to some of the interesting blogs that UBC is doing. I don't know if you know this, but a couple of VPs have just started blogging, including finance and student services, Brian Sullivan, and getting comments and making YouTube videos. And it'll be interesting to see if this experiment perpetuates. It was actually initiated by them, interestingly enough. And if you want a contrary opinion, the UBC Insider's blog is actually from some very politically connected at UBC students who often are not terribly reticent about posting very frank and interesting opinions. I'd also just point to Dean Giustini's quite popular blog. It started as the Google Scholar blog, and he gets an impressive amount of traffic and incoming links for this service. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I mean, and then there's kind of slightly more formal blogs where this is essentially postings of either ongoing news reports or actual scholarly ongoing work related to a research project. And this actually brings in people from a number of institutions as well. And these type of projects, I mean, almost every single one of the things I just showed you, pretty much self-managing in the sense that usually all it's required to get this up and running at the most might be a half-hour consultation meeting. So these are relatively lightweight applications and not quite as in-depth as some of the stuff that, that Jeff was showing. John Beasley Murray, he was the guy that was supposedly pro-social media and kept offering all sorts of subverting notions, including the notion that this university shouldn't be supporting open platforms. I just want to point out a little bit of his hypocrisy, if I may. I consider him a friend, so hopefully he won't be too angry. It is true. The very first time I met with him, he told me he wanted to get his students blogging. I said, well, that's great, actually. We got this platform, and the students are welcome to use it. If you like, I'd be happy to do a workshop. And he goes, well, no, and for the reasons he stated, I have personal ethical objections to students being forced to use university platforms. I want them to control their own digital identity. I want them to choose their own tools and make those decisions for themselves. And I don't want the power to be able to delete their material. I want them to have that autonomy. So what he did do is basically he tells the students that they can choose whatever blog platform they want. And he tells them what options. Almost all of them, this first student hasn't done very much, almost all of them choose Blogger. And he thinks that's just because they already have Gmail accounts, so they don't have to sign up for another account. But anyway, so most of them choose it. Essentially what this particular site does, though, is as long as you have an RSS feed attached to it, and almost any blog platform worth using does, not only for the service, the blog as a whole, but for individual categories as well, you'll have feeds. We can actually ingest these feeds into this collaborative blog space. So essentially when the students post on their own blogs, and they can choose if they wish, if, for example, if they use their blog for other things, they can designate just one category, which would be then ingested into the course. So you kind of hopefully get some of the strengths of both approaches. On the one hand, the students all get their own space, they control it. If they want to keep their blog after they graduate, whatever, that's their decision. At the same time, you do get things like shared categories, a shared discussion space, and there's only one place that everyone's got to keep track of. You don't have to, monitor 35 different blog spaces and platforms to keep up with the class. So we've been doing that for some time. Just to point out, too, that you can actually get quite in-depth in terms of blogs essentially as content management systems to build sites that don't really look like blogs. I just want to really underline that. WordPress, actually in the next release, will stop calling itself a product that builds blogs. They're going to be building sites. It's a small terminology. I don't think it'll make a huge difference, but you can see there's really nothing bloggy about this particular site. It's a content management system that you can operate right off the web that you don't need Dreamweaver for, and adapts to certain, of course, standards. I'll just leave it at that. I'll skip most of this. I do want to give some shout outs to our team at OLT. This particular post really brought home to me why I love our tech group so much. So this is a post by our systems admin, Scott McMillan. And Scott is the first systems administrator who tells me no on a weekly basis that I've yet come to love. In the sense that I'm used to fighting with IT and saying, I want this feature, and they go, no, you can't do that. Scott puts a great deal of effort. When he says no, it's because he has really examined the issue and he really understands the pros and cons of, say, having a certain feature. So this is a graph that indicates server response time on WordPress, and this is something that happened back in January. And what did he do? He removed 3 plugins that he had been monitoring and realized that they were actually draining system resources and people weren't really using it. It's the kind of thing that he just does really well, and I feel really grateful to have someone like that manning the ship. And just in terms of future press or future directions, Jeff alluded to this thing called BuddyPress. We're hoping to roll this out in the summer. BuddyPress is essentially a social network layer that you can kind of sit on top of WordPress so that you get things like, for example, when you create your blog account, you get profiles. And those members belong to certain, you can have, for example, groups. So you could quite organically, as part of your profile, belong to, say, 2 or 3 different groups, one of which might be a course, another of which might be a science fiction movie club, and you can essentially have something like threaded discussions within those groups, and also get updates on blog posts relevant to that group. And CUNY are, to my knowledge, the only people who've really installed this in an educational setting and really made it work. So they're very much our model on this. And I'm going to cut to the chase.
Brian, was there one stat that was really impressive last summer I heard is that approaching 25% of web traffic at UBC is now being generated off of blog platforms?
Wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But that's
Really
phenomenal.
something.
Oh, that does remind me, I won't demo because I don't have a quick link for it, but I also heard that something like 15% of web access is now coming off of mobile devices on the UBC network. And just to point out that UBC Blogs actually has the WP Touch plugin, so you get a mobile optimized views and interactions. And actually there is a WordPress application, so you could actually update your blog from your mobile device. I mean, obviously you don't want to be writing long entries, but you can do things like respond to comments or delete spam or whatever. And again, actually our spam control is quite good now. That's one of the advantages of our CWL authentication. Just to point out too that this wiki, which you're seeing here, actually is also CWL enabled. So in other words, if you have a CWL, you don't have to ask us for an account, you've got one. And you can go in and you can start creating pages and let her rip. Come back to this one. As you can see, there's just constantly activity happening on the platform. It's really, and without us doing a whole lot of stuff. But I just want to show one more thing before we go. Oh, actually, 2 things. Sorry. One is that there is a plugin that we developed in WordPress that allows you to take content from any MediaWiki site, not just the one we support, so with Wikipedia, for example, and render it inside WordPress with a more kind of finely grained style sheet. So for example, that's the exact same content that I just showed you. If you actually see, those are those same links here, but put inside the classic UBC common look and feel, and you don't see edit links. You have no, so essentially what you can do is you can treat the wiki as an environment where you're doing all your collaborative authoring, but to the world, to the people who don't need to know how you're putting your content together, you can make it look however you like, including like a traditional official website. So you get kind of the easy authoring of the wiki with essentially the presentation. And I just have to show the Wikibooks function. This is something that I really hope people will take more advantage of. So we're starting to use this for, say, our own user documentation. So we got some WordPress tutorials that we've been building in our unit. Let's say somebody wants a print version of it. We start the book creator up. And essentially what I can do is, I can, for example, I could just from here just say, yeah, I'll take that one in my book. I'll take the video resources page. And I'll take the little widgets page. I'm hoping I'm going to do more. So this is the book of the 3 items I've done. If I want, I can reorder it, drag and dropping. I could create chapters to add certain things to each other. I'll do this as fast as I can. WordPress book. So essentially, so that's the book I want to have. And now I want the PDF version of it. Usually it processes fairly quickly. And now I have the file. I'll download it to my computer. And there it is. And those wiki pages are now placed into a book where the content is actually formatted in a print-friendly format. So all the crap from the website is gone. This images rendered quite nicely. And it actually looks like, you know, quality print publication right out of the wiki. The license is there. And this is the part I really like, is that actual, at the end, you actually get all of the hyperlinks that you've created get treated like references. So you get footnotes. So if you link to something inside the wiki page, you don't have that cruddy URL there, you just get a footnote with that added at the end. And it also actually tracks who contributed to each of the individual articles at the end, so you got your attribution, as well as all of the external things like images and stuff that you pasted in, and the license status of them. So really, what we see MediaWiki as between its ability to publish to other websites, and as well the print generation capabilities, that MediaWiki really is a publishing platform for a number of range of media. So. And I meant to get you early. Now you can go. Sorry to keep you late. I hope you get a good lunch.
I'd like to thank Brian and Jeff